What's up everybody? Let me show you how I replaced the wheel bearing on my Acura TSX. Let's secure the car on jack stands and remove the wheel. The spindle nut should have an indentation on the outer lip. You can use a punch and a hammer to undo that. Of course, it's easier to use an impact to remove that spindle nut. But you can also use a breaker bar, and you'll need to insert a screwdriver or a metal punch into the rotor from the middle of the brake caliper. This will keep the hub from spinning. Next, we need to remove the caliper assembly. Remove the brake line bracket. Next, remove the caliper bracket mounting bolts. Now you can set the caliper assembly to the side and put it on top of a bucket. There is a wheel sensor that's on the knuckle. Disconnect the cable bracket from the knuckle. And remove that speed sensor. Now let's remove the rotor. It's held on by two retaining screws. Easiest way to remove those is by using an impact driver with a large hammer. If the rotor is stuck after you remove the retaining screws, you'll need to insert two bolts into the holes on the rotor. As you thread in the two 8 by 1.25 millimeter bolts, it will push out the rotor. The car has 3 ball joints attached to the steering knuckle. The upper control arm ball joint, the lower control arm ball joint, which is attached to the knuckle itself, and the outer tie rod ball joint. Let's start by removing the cotter pins from all 3 ball joints. The easiest method I found was to use some nippers. Unbend the cotter pin so it's straight and pull out with the nippers. I didn't record the removal of the other 2 cotter pins. Next, remove all 3 nuts. If the lower ball joint nut keeps spinning and it does not remove from the ball joint, use your floor jack to lift the steering knuckle, and that should help remove the nut. Then separate the ball joints. I use a ball joint separator to pop the ball joints out of place. I know a lot of people on YouTube use a big hammer and they hit what the ball joint goes into. Start with the tie rod. Then remove the upper ball joint. Then the lower ball joint. Next, you'll hit the axle from the outside to ensure that it slides out of the wheel hub. Okay, let's lift the steering knuckle, pull out the axle, and then wiggle that knuckle out. Pry out that knuckle ring. Now we're ready to separate the wheel hub from the bearing. To push the wheel hub away from the bearing, I use a socket and a big hammer and just whack it out. You can reuse the wheel hub, but you'll need to remove that inner race that's still on the wheel hub. To make the job easier, you can just buy new wheel hubs. To remove the inner race from the wheel hub, I used the rotary tool. It came with a free metal cutoff wheel, and it took about 5 to 6 minutes in order to get that inner race removed. So you'll need to cut a groove at an angle and then use a hammer and chisel to make a fracture on the inner race. And then you can pry out the inner race. I have also used a cutoff wheel attached to a drill, and that works just as good. So right here I'm filing down some gouges that I made on the wheel hub. The manual recommends to remove the splash guard, but I found that it's not necessary. There's a large snap ring that's holding in the bearing from the outside of the knuckle. I recommend using 7-inch or larger circlip pliers for this. This can be very frustrating. After many failed attempts, I realized that when I compress the snap ring, the opposite end leaves a gap. So with one hand I compressed the snap ring, and with the other hand I inserted my screwdriver. Notice how I keep my palm over the snap ring because I don't want it to fly into my face. Now we're ready to press out the bearing from the knuckle bore. I bought this bearing press tool. So this tool is basically a large nut and bolt with different sized plates on it. The bearing is going to be pressed out through the outer side of the knuckle. From the inside of the knuckle, I'm going to use a plate that only presses on the wheel bearing. From the outside of the knuckle, I am using a cup, and that's where the bearing is going to fall into. Lubricate the threads on the tool with oil or grease. Insert your 2 washers, the bolt, and the nut. Hand tighten everything first. I find it easier to hold that long nut with a crescent wrench than drive the bolt with an impact wrench. Now let's press in our new bearing. I know a lot of people put the bearing in the freezer overnight before they install it, which makes it easier to press in, but it's not necessary to do that. You can clean the bore with a brush and some brake cleaner and lubricate the hole with some grease. One side of the bearing is magnetic. That's the side that communicates with the wheel sensor. I use the paper clip to identify the magnetic side. The magnetic side needs to face towards the car, not away from the car. The next part is very important. Find a plate that presses only on the outer race of the bearing. The other plate needs to lock into the lip on the inside of the knuckle. Tighten everything together. The bearing may not sit flush into that bore, so you may need a hammer to tap it evenly. Keep your eyeball on the bearing and make sure it's entering flush. The first time I ever did this, I didn't notice that the bearing was entering crooked. I hammered it in with an impact and made a dent on the inside of the knuckle. Now I can see the bearing is going in straight. I press it in with my wrench and I can feel it bottom out when it's fully inserted. When it bottoms out, you should have enough space to insert that snap ring. Now let's press the hub into the bearing. From the inner side of the knuckle, use a small plate that is going to catch only onto the bearing inner race. This is very important. On the outer side, use a plate that is going to fit anywhere on the wheel hub. You can use some grease onto the wheel hub so that it slides in smoother. Alright, let's tighten it all together. Once again, I'm going to use my wrench because when it bottoms out, I can really feel it with my wrench. Let me show you how close that hub is to the knuckle once it bottoms out. Spin it and make sure it's smooth and quiet. Very important, don't forget to put the knuckle ring back on. Align the ring with the hole for the wheel sensor. Let's put it all back together now. Insert the axle and then the lower ball joint and then the upper ball joint. And then the outer tie rod. Thread the 3 nuts of the ball joints by hand. Before you torque everything down, the OEM manual suggests that you lift the knuckle, so use your floor jack and support from under the lower control arm, and then torque everything down. Now you can insert your 3 new cotter pins. Don't reuse the old ones. If you need to align the hole with the castle nut, only tighten but do not loosen. The service manual wants you to insert the cotter pins from the front of the vehicle going to the back of the vehicle. Sometimes the ball joint hole is not going to permit that. There are 2 methods for folding the cotter pin. Either of these 2 is fine. Let's get that rotor back on. Insert the retaining screws and tighten with a screwdriver, but don't tighten with the impact driver because you'll regret it the next time you're going to remove that rotor. Make sure the splash guard doesn't rub and hit the rotor when you put everything back together. If it does, just unbend it with your hand. It's a little bit tricky to get the caliper assembly back on. Take your time, be persistent. Okay, to torque the spindle nut, you will need to insert like a screwdriver or a punch pin into the rotor to lock it in place. The torque specs for that is 181 foot-pounds, but my torque wrench goes up to 150 and I use that and that's fine. In the end, it's recommended to use a chisel and hammer to make that locking tab on the spindle nut. This is not an easy job, okay? I've damaged 2 bearings doing this. One bearing I actually pushed out the inner race while pressing it in. The other bearing I forgot to reinstall a snap ring and damaged the bearing while pressing out the hub. If you find that your new bearing is bad within a month, then it may be due to an error in the installation. Good luck, thanks for watching, and there's more information in the description of the video.